Hey, let's talk about the origins of what we call communion. At first glance, it's obvious it started back when Jesus instituted it at what we call the Lord's Supper or Last Supper. You might be picturing Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting called The Last Supper. Jesus seated in the middle of the table with the disciples on either side of him, reacting as he said that one of them would betray him. And we know that after this dinner, Jesus went to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it was there that he was arrested after Judas Iscariot gave him a kiss, alerting the captors to who he was. Jesus was then taken to trial, where ultimately he was sentenced to death. He was immediately beaten and nailed to a cross, where he died. He was then buried and 3 days later resurrected. Back to the Last Supper. Can we imagine for a moment what this was like? What were the disciples' reactions to Jesus proposing this dinner? We can read about this moment in the Gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Basically, we have no recorded reaction because there wasn't one. Jesus simply told them to prepare for the Passover, and they did. But why did they so readily go to prepare the meal? Because it was something they had done every year their entire lives. This was the time of Passover. The Lord's Supper, which we commemorate now as communion, was begun at the meal of Passover. Most people are aware of this history of Passover, but let's explain it. You might expect me to first talk about Egypt and the Pharaoh, but no, we're going all the way back to Abraham. About 2,000 years, give or take, before Jesus had this last meal, God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. God tells Abraham his people will live in what was then known as the land of Canaan, and to God's people, it was the promised land. Over the ensuing years, God's people ended up not in the promised land, rather in Egypt by way of Joseph. Remember him? Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and those buyers sold Joseph to Potiphar, one of the rulers in Egypt. Now, Joseph basically becomes the second in charge of the known world at the time and brings his family to live in Egypt. They settle down in Goshen. You can think of it kind of like a suburb, and they multiply. Hundreds of years later, Pharaoh is worried the Israelites are becoming too numerous, so he orders all baby boys killed. Enter Moses, who is placed by his mother in a basket and floated down the Nile River, where he is found by the Pharaoh's daughter, who then raises him as her own. Are you with me? If you've heard these stories many times, you're probably following along fine. And if not, it's fascinating. Go look it up. Seriously, the Old Testament is like the best soap opera. You should check it out. So here we are in Egypt, where God's people, the Israelites, were slaves. Moses, who had been born an Israelite but raised as an Egyptian living in the palace of the Pharaoh, was called by God to go and free his people from Egypt. And Moses pleads with Pharaoh multiple times to let the Israelites leave, and he always says no. God sends 9 plagues that don't change Pharaoh's mind, but the 10th one does the trick. God warns that during the night, the oldest male child of each household will be stricken dead. But there is a preventative measure. The Israelites can take a perfect lamb, kill it, and spread its blood around the doorframe of their houses. If during the night the angel of death saw the blood, he would know to pass over that house and not kill the son inside. Now this drives the Pharaoh to release the slaves and send them on their way, not forgetting, of course, the chase that ends badly for the Pharaoh. Once they are safe, God tells the people to remember this day by having a particular meal every year at that time. They are instructed to retell the story of the Passover every year, so their children and their children's children and so forth would always remember how their Lord God saved them. The goal after this escape was to travel to the Promised Land, where God would deliver it to his people. After some circumstances caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, the remaining Israelites took possession of Canaan with the leadership of Joshua. Moses had died, rather dramatically, at a ripe old age, looking into the Promised Land, knowing he was barred from entering. Seriously, the Old Testament is so dramatic. I love it. Of course, we know the Promised Land, Canaan, now is Israel and surrounding areas. This is the land where we eventually get to Jesus and his ministry. And now we're back where we began. Jesus has instructed his disciples to prepare the Passover meal. But Jesus knows it's the last meal he will have on earth. The disciples do not. If this were your last meal before death, what would you do? And we might think of all the foods we're going to miss, right? Donuts and ice cream, fried chicken and biscuits. But we will also be concerned with our goodbyes, being with those we love. If this were your last day on earth, you're not going to spend it working or shopping. You'll spend it in your home with the ones closest to you. And this is what Jesus does. In our next video, we'll look at the elements of the dinner and their significance to the disciples, as well as to us.